Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us this afternoon. My name is Carolyn, and I work on the communications team at Ecojustice. Together with my colleagues Venetia and Caroline, I'll be working behind the scenes to help run today's online conversation. I'm joining today from my makeshift office in my kitchen in Vancouver, and Vancouver is also where Ecojustice has its headquarters. As such, I'd like to first acknowledge that I work and live on the unceded ancestral territories of the Musqueam, the Squamish, and the Tsleil-Waututh nations. And as I offer this land acknowledgement, I'm reflecting on the importance of Indigenous knowledge. There's a beautiful book by Robin Wall Kimmerer called Braiding Sweetgrass that I've been rereading. And Robin, she's a member of the citizen band Potawatomi, and she's also a scientist and a mother. And in this book, she shares a wealth of Indigenous knowledge. And I find that her work is such a warm invitation to live in a balanced, reciprocal relationship with nature. And she says that sort of that act of reciprocity in terms of living with the land is really the essence of traditional knowledge. So I'm really excited for today's conversation. I think you're in for a real treat. And in just a moment, Ecojustice's Executive Director, Devin Page, is going to hop online. But before we get into things, I want to quickly go over some housekeeping items to get you comfortable with the online platform we're using. If you joined last time, this is going to be a little bit of a review, but just to make the space inclusive for everyone, please just bear with us. So on the right hand of your screen, you'll see an image of the control panel. There's three features I want to point out. The grab tab, it's the orange arrow at the top left of your control panel. And clicking on it will expand or minimize the panel. And with your control panel expanded, you'll see you've got two audio options, computer audio or phone call. To switch between the two, click on the circle beside your preferred audio option. If you want to use your phone, this is where you can find instructions for calling in. And if you're using computer audio, we do recommend that you use a headset for best quality. And then finally, let's just quickly go over the question box, which is where you can submit comments and questions at any point during today's conversation. We do have time set aside at the end for a question and answer period, but you can, and I encourage you to send your questions at any time as they arise throughout Margot's presentation. And just so you know, whatever you submit via the chat box can only be seen by me and my communications colleagues. So I'll be forwarding your questions along to Devin and Margot. And also, just so you know, I have the capability to send messages to the entire group, but I can't send individual messages to each of you. So if you want to go ahead and send a comment or question now, just if you'd like to test out that question box, and I'll hand things over to Devin.
Hi, everyone, and welcome to Ecojustice's #BetterThanNormal conversation series. I'm Devin Page. I'm your host for today's conversation. I'm the Executive Director of Ecojustice, and I'm talking to you from my home office in Vancouver, BC. And I'll lay one of your concerns at the outset. I was asked in a previous webinar if I'm in danger of falling down the stairs behind me. They're farther away than they appear, so you can focus your questions on our work and not my safety. Now we're going to get you engaging with the comment and question box right off the bat. We want to know where you're calling us from. We've got quite a few people on the line, and why don't you take a minute and just share with us your location? So all I can say is that reflecting the fact that we are across the country, so are the comments. And there's people popping up comments from coast to coast to coast. In terms of Ecojustice, we're Canada's largest environmental law charity and operate offices in Vancouver, Calgary, Toronto, Ottawa, and Halifax. In Halifax, we're celebrating our second anniversary. So we've been pleased in the last few years to be able to grow our services and represent more of the national interest in protecting the environment. As many of you know, Ecojustice's mission is to use the courts and the power of law to defend nature, combat climate change, and fight for a healthy environment for all of us. Our lawyers are divided into teams that work across the country in 3 areas: nature, climate change, and healthy communities. Now, being some of the best and brightest legal minds in the country, they strive for long-term results that build the case for a better Earth. The way we work is that we work strategically with clients and partners, choosing those cases that have the potential to set precedents and redefine how environmental laws are applied and enforced in Canada to provide long-term, durable, real protection for the environment. Going through the courts means a lot of work, but it's often, and particularly it seems more these days, a necessary course of action for ensuring that our communities and the climate and the environment are protected by the full weight of the law. Which brings us to today's conversation with Margo Venton, who is the director of Ecojustice's Nature Program. We started this conversation series a few weeks ago because we wanted to give our community of supporters an inside look at what we're doing to make sure Canada is better than normal when we're on the other side of the COVID pandemic. And in a lot of ways to let folks know that not only are we continuing business, in many ways we're busy, and Margo's team in particular has been busier with efforts to defend Canada's species at risk and the places they call home. So Margo's going to be talking about the work of the Nature team. Those of you familiar with Ecojustice and Margo's recent work will know her in particular as the lead lawyer in litigation to protect BC's marine environment. And so, for example, that means her successful litigation to protect Canada's wild salmon stocks from diseases spread by fish farms, as well what can only be called tireless efforts and successful efforts to defend one of Canada's iconic species, the southern resident killer whales. So Margo's going to be up next, and during her talk, we encourage you to use the chat box to ask questions. At the end of Margo's presentation, I'll facilitate a question and answer session using the questions that you've provided. So Margo, over to you.
Okay, thanks, Devin, and hello, everyone. I am Margo Venton, and I'm joining you today from my home office on North Pender Island, which for you, those of you not familiar with the geography of coastal British Columbia, Pender Island is found in the Salish Sea between Vancouver and Vancouver Island, and within the traditional territory of the Coast Salish peoples, including the Saanich and the Cowichan nations. North Pender is actually known as Sideus in the Sinchothan language, which is a word that means wind drying and refers to the seasonal drying of salmon. And this is because the Southern Gulf Islands are along the migration route of the Fraser River salmon. And every year, including today, but in previous times, there would the Fraser River was the world's largest salmon producing and continues to be the world's largest salmon producer river. I'm going to talk today a little bit about Ecojustice's strategy to address the biodiversity crisis and how COVID-19 is affecting that work. And as many of you know, we are in the midst of an environmental crisis, and there's 3 main drivers to that crisis. There's climate change, pollution, and the decline in global biodiversity. And the biodiversity crisis is sometimes seen as the least important of these environmental problems, which is truly unfortunate because in reality, the biodiversity crisis reflects the failing of our life support system. We could change the slide. The first question I think it's important to be clear on is, what is biodiversity? What do we mean when we say that? Really, it's the diversity of ecosystems and of species living within those ecosystems, and then the genetic diversity within individual species. Biodiversity is really critical to human life on Earth. It This diversity of species and plants and animals drives the Earth's living system that provides the basic services that keep communities alive. Filtering of fresh water, filtering of the air, allowing the soil to regenerate and grow food, and breaking down waste and recycling waste. Biodiversity and wilderness also provide important buffers against the other environmental harms, challenges like climate change and pollution. And as I'm sure many of you know, there's been a lot of discussion of this in the news lately. Biodiversity and intact functioning ecosystems also protect human communities from zoonotic diseases, and the decline in biodiversity and intact ecosystems is associated with the increased risk of pandemics. And of course, we understand that COVID-19 itself is a zoonotic disease, which is a disease that's jumped from an animal community to a human community. Nature and biodiversity are also obviously spiritually and culturally important, and also a source of human innovation. So really what is increasingly clear is that human development and well-being are reliant on healthy natural ecosystems. If we could change the slide. The challenge here is that biodiversity is in decline. In some ways biodiversity can be likened to like a net or a web, all sorts of strands intertwined. You can take a few strands out. You can take an individual strand and unwind it and make it thinner. You can even punch a hole in a net somewhere and it will still continue to function. But if you take out enough strands, then the net stops performing its essential function. And at a certain point, if you take enough strands out or you punch a big enough holes, the whole thing falls apart. And there's evidence today that that's essentially what's happening to biodiversity on Earth. Our systems are failing to provide their basic functions, and in some cases have already failed. So when I look for reliable information about the health of the world's ecosystems, I turn to a few trusted resources, including something called the Living Planet Report series, which is a great production. It's a co-production between the World Wildlife Fund, which is a long-standing partner of Ecojustice, and the Zoological Society of London. And they do something every 2 years called the Living Planet Index, which is a measure of the health of 16,704 populations of approximately 4,000 species. And they chart those over time. And what that shows, and what's illustrated on this graph, is that between 1970 and 2014, which was the last data set that they had, there's been a 60% decline in species diversity. That means that on average, animal populations are well under half the size they were in 1970. And the key drivers of that decline, as identified in the report, are overexploitation of species and land degradation or habitat loss. So, and if we turn the slide, another interesting thing to know about the biodiversity crisis, and in particular the loss of ecosystem diversity, is that remaining wildlife globally is not spread out evenly. This is a map that was produced in 2018, and it shows the remaining basically wild places, wilderness. And amazingly, this was a meta study that compiled a tremendous amount of data of coverage maps that looked at where are there large intact ecosystems that are unfragmented. And their study showed that essentially 70% of the remaining wilderness in the world is really concentrated in only 5 countries, and Canada is one of those countries. And in fact, Canada has the second largest amount of intact natural ecosystem, both on the land and in the marine ecosystem globally. So Canada actually plays a critical role in the future of biodiversity protection on Earth. And to put that another way, the steps that Canada takes or fails to take to limit expansion of roads and shipping lanes, and to rein in large-scale developments in mining and forestry and agriculture and aquaculture and industrial fishing will be critical to the way that the planet looks to future generations, and really to our own children. So if we can change the slide, so how is Ecojustice responding to the biodiversity crisis given this information about the state of the world? The nature team has 4 main goals. The first is 0 species extinction. And essentially that's because we don't entirely understand how the net works together, all the pieces, how all the parts fit together. So if we can keep all the parts, it'll bring a lot of the ecosystem function along with it. Our second goal, and that's really driven by that slide showing remaining wilderness on the planet, is to protect large areas of undisturbed wilderness. That's important for Canadian biodiversity, but it's also important for global health. The third goal, and this is a really an ambitious goal given the state of Canadian law now, is to recognize and protect ecosystem limits and preserve ecosystem function. And as I'll talk in a little bit, a real challenge with Canadian environmental law is that it does not really protect ecosystem limits. It doesn't really recognize the way in which the system functions as a whole and where those thresholds are, those tipping points where the net will start to fall apart if we take out any more strands. And then the final of our 4 goals is the recognition of the rights of nature, which is, I will say, both a very old and a very new concept. In many ways, it's an idea that has been central to many Indigenous legal systems for millennia, or I guess for a very long time, but also it is an emerging concept in environmental law today, and it seeks to recognize that natural systems and they have their own inherent utility and worth and should be protected for their own sake, in addition to being important to humans. So how does that work? How do those broad goals translate into the work that we're doing right now? Well, first of all, if we can change the slide, first of all, this is the nature team. And as you can see, we are spread across the country. We have lawyers on both coasts. We have lawyers in the middle. We have a number of our lawyers who work also on northern issues from their southern offices. And that's really because in Canada and everywhere, nature is diffuse. It's everywhere, and it's actually really critical to be protecting ecosystem and biodiversity all across the country, both on a large scale and on a small scale. So turning to our specific work on the next slide. So protecting species by protecting their habitat, that's really the central principle of a lot of our endangered species work. And the main work, most of our species protection work in Canada is really done with through the Federal Species at Risk Act. It's the main tool for protecting habitat of threatened and endangered species. And in some places, notably all the provinces west of Ontario, where there is no endangered species legislation at all, it's really our only tool. So the Species at Risk Act is intended to prevent species extinction and provide for the recovery of species. It's been a law in Canada since 2003, and it's supposed to achieve species recovery by prohibiting direct harm to species and protecting critical habitat and mandating recovery plans for species. So the central weakness of SARA, however, is that the protection of critical habitat only comes after it is first identified in a recovery strategy, and that can take years. And then once it's identified, in the case of terrestrial species in provinces, the protection of critical habitat only kicks in if the federal government makes the politically difficult decision to apply the federal law on provincial land. And so, as we have seen through our work with the boreal caribou, this is really a difficult thing to make happen. Unfortunately, the federal government has never chosen to protect the habitat of species on provincial land. So we've been working for years to attempt to make them to use that power to protect boreal caribou. Now, the historic range of the boreal caribou covered over half of present-day Canada. It stretched from Alaska to Labrador. Their former range stretched into the United States, but there are now effectively no populations in the eastern United States and only several dozen animals remaining in Idaho and the state of Washington. So really, for there to be caribou in the future, it's all on Canada. The challenge with boreal caribou is that they prefer lichen-rich mature forests. They are considered the leading indicator of old growth forest health. And part of the reason we have focused on protecting caribou is if we can protect the ecosystems that support caribou and we can keep caribou around, then we have water quality in all of these diverse areas. Native fish are protected, native bird species also benefit because they all also live in old growth ecosystems. Unfortunately, the biggest risk to caribou is industrial development and particular road building. And so that is really why they're threatened. As we increase the roads for resource exploration and forestry, their habitat is fragmented and this exposes them to greater risk of predation. And all the boreal caribou populations across the country are at risk. In Ontario's, and this focuses on the work that we've been doing in Ontario, that's our Ontario team, and in Ontario, that work is being done in partnership with the David Suzuki Foundation and Ontario Nature and the Wildlands League. And basically, we have been working for those organizations to try and have the federal government finally recognize that Ontario's protection of critical habitat is not effective. They're not effectively protecting the through their own laws, which have, as those of you who are from Ontario know, have recently been even more weakened. And that would compel then the federal government to have to finally step in. So if we could change to the next slide. So in addition to attempting to protect species by protecting their habitat, we are also trying to protect species by recognizing ecosystem limits. And this work right now, I think, is best reflected in our work to protect the southern resident killer whale. And as David mentioned, I've been working with a group of fantastic clients for more than a decade to try to recover the critically endangered southern resident killer whale. There are only 72 southern residents remaining, and they are threatened, unfortunately, by three key threats. The first is declining availability of their preferred salmon, or their preferred prey, which is Chinook salmon. And as those of you who are from British Columbia will know, Chinook populations themselves are considered to be endangered and threatened, and have been in decline for the last several decades. In addition to that, the southern residents are threatened by noise and also by historical pollution, which is bioaccumulated into their bodies and staying in and resides in their fat tissue. So unfortunately, all three of these threats combine to push the southern residents further away from recovery and towards extinction. And a key piece that we have been focusing on is trying to address, because it's very difficult to address declining salmon on its own, and it's very difficult to deal with historical pollution. We've been focusing on this issue of physical and acoustic disturbance, which is essentially caused by boat traffic and shipping and whale watching and recreational boats and all the myriad of on-the-water activities that happen in the busy Salish Sea. The reason that's a problem is that the killer whales rely on sound in the same way that we rely on sight. They do almost all their basic life functions they rely on their ears. And most importantly, they hunt using echolocation. That is essentially a system, a process of making little clicking sounds and waiting for the clicking sounds to go out through the water and hit an object, and then the sound bounces back off that object, and then the whales listen to that sound, and then they understand what that object is. And killer whales' sense of sound is so fine-tuned that they can actually distinguish between a Chinook salmon and any other kind of fish in the sea. And again and again and again, killer whale researchers have documented hunting southern resident, picking an individual Chinook salmon out of a school of other fish. So that ability to hear is so critical and is quite, and at the moment, unfortunately, the sound in the Salish Sea has gotten to be so great that up to 90% of the space for killer whale communication is taken up during busy shipping time. And so what we and our clients have been attempting to do is to have for there to be a recognition that we need to protect the acoustic quality of the Salish Sea as a whole. We need to understand how quiet it needs to be for marine mammals to flourish, and we need to keep noise levels under that threshold. And really, it's only by doing that that we will see recovery over the long term. And so if we turn to the next slide, what's going to happen next? So really, I think what we need to see happen coming out of COVID-19 is a pivot. And we talk about that in a lot of different contexts, but we really need to recognize that in order for us to maintain species biodiversity, and to maintain biodiversity and functioning ecosystems, we need to deal with we need to manage the land differently. Our legal systems need to change to reflect the biological reality that humans are a part of a functioning whole, and that whole natural system needs to be functioning for humans to survive and flourish. I think we have a really interesting opportunity right now in Canada to bring in and recognize the diverse legal traditions that are reflected amongst the Indigenous communities across Canada, who have traditionally through Indigenous law, which is not one cohesive whole, but there are some themes that appear again and again and again across nations. And one of those themes is the recognition that humans are part of an interconnected system. And if you affect one part of that system, it will have consequences somewhere else. And then finally, I think we also need to start to move down the road of recognizing in law those ecosystem limits, and also recognizing the rights of nature, moving beyond the concept of nature as a commodity, as something to be owned, as something that is simply a resource, and also valuing it as something which exists in its own right, which I think would be the attitudinal shift that would allow for us to really rethink our entire relationship with the natural world. Unfortunately, one of the real challenges is going to be the push to quickly return to exactly what we have. And unfortunately, in particular, when it comes to talking about nature, I think we often hear the story that species are things that are nice to have. Nature is a luxury, is something that we will protect once we have enough economic wealth to be able to do so. And I think now is probably the most important time in human history to really push against that narrative and push against those arguments, because really, as I think we've seen when we look at what nature does for human beings and the degree to which it is under threat, that's a narrative that we need to really change to move forward and to flourish. And I'm happy to take any questions about our work.
Okay, Margot, I continue not to do any of the hard work here, and we have some great questions. So I think I'm going to try to stagger these from warm you up, and then we'll see how we go. Okay, first of all, we've got questions from all parts of the country, so it's interesting. We'll get regionally specific on this. But the first one, will there be any work done on caribou in Northern Ontario? Despite the requirements under the Species at Risk Act, the current Ontario government has no interest in addressing this.
So I think the short answer is yes, that work is underway. We have a team, as I mentioned earlier in the presentation. We are working with some partners in Ontario on protection of Ontario caribou. Part of the challenge in making the case for the federal government to step in and use the power it has under the Species at Risk Act is the need to put together the evidence that shows that effectively that the provincial laws do not effectively protect critical habitat And that is a really long process. It requires a bunch of analysis. It requires a bunch of mapping. Some of the partners we're working with Ontario are really great at doing that kind of mapping. And then our lawyers put together all that information and basically enter into a combination of demanding and dialogue with the government about what to do about that information. And that's really the process we're in at the moment. But as you know, if you live in Ontario, it's true that the Ontario Endangered Species Act has been significantly weakened, unfortunately, by the Ford administration, and had previously already been weakened once by a previous administration. And therefore, I think the case now that Ontario's law does not effectively protect critical habitat is much stronger than it was before.
Okay, let's go to the West Coast. What's next in the fight to protect orca from the Trans Mountain Pipeline?
Oh, wow. That's a question close to my heart, so thank you for asking it. So for those of you who follow the orca case closely, you will know that after successfully setting aside the first approval of the Trans Mountain Pipeline expansion because of failure to consider the marine impacts of the additional tanker traffic on the endangered southern residents, there was a reconsideration process that took about a year. The government reissued, like basically made the same approval again with some additional commitments to offset the impacts of the marine shipping on the orcas. And then we were not granted permission to challenge that decision before the courts, which is very disappointing. And however, we do continue to work with our clients on what is now I'm considering the permitting and approval phase of the project. The government maintains that it has committed to offset the impacts of the tanker traffic on killer whales. And we now have to turn to the permitting phase and the approval phase of the project to hold them to that commitment. So it's now playing out at a much more detailed level than it was before because the environmental assessment part has ended. But as I like to think every day, the project's not built yet and no tankers have sailed. So if it is not possible, which the evidence suggests maybe it's not, to truly offset the impacts of the tankers, then we say SARA does not allow those boats to go back and forth through critical habitat. So that may be the next great moment of conflict in that case.
Okay, Margo, we're going to step it up. This is your chance to explain to everybody simply federal and provincial jurisdiction. The question, I find it strange the phrase, apply the federal law on provincial land. Isn't all federal land also provincial land and vice versa?
Okay, so that is a great question and one that I think confounds and confuses even like law students. What federal and provincial jurisdiction? Yeah, federal and provincial just when it comes to responsibility. So under the Constitution, responsibilities are divided up between the federal government and the provincial government. And when it comes to dealing with land, the majority of our land mass is actually the jurisdiction of the province. So within British Columbia, for example, all of the crown land is the responsibility of the province. And the province, therefore, first, under the Species at Risk Act plan, is responsible for protecting endangered species in British Columbia, except, of course, in places like national parks, which are considered federal land. And in reserve communities, which are also considered federal land, or in the case of communities that have signed agreements with Canada, that would be Indigenous land. But outside of those small areas, it's all up to the provincial government. The challenge is, ages ago, when we proposed an Endangered Species Act the first time, Canada, when Canada introduced the legislation, the idea was that there was an agreement within the provinces that the provinces would take the first stab at protecting species on provincial lands, and the federal government would only ever intervene where that species protection was ineffective. And that agreement was solidified in quite an old document called the National Accord for Species Protection, or for the protection of species at risk. And it predated the passage of SARA, and it really informed and shaped the structure of that act. Now, the problem is that many of the provinces, including all the provinces west of Ontario, did not fulfill the obligation. They're part of the bargain. They didn't pass any endangered species law. And in many of the provinces east of Ontario, including Ontario, there is endangered species law, but it has been either weakened or not enforced after years and years of delay, which is a situation we've been trying to address in the maritime provinces. So that is essentially how the situation works. And now, for us to have the federal standards applied to that provincial land, we have to go through this very long process of proving and forcing the federal government to acknowledge that proof that the provincial law is not effectively protecting the species within their jurisdiction. I don't know if I did a good job of that, Devin, but maybe you have something to add.
I think you did a great job. You know, the one thing I'll say is when I was in law school, I thought the division in authority called jurisdiction between the provinces and the federal government meant they both be protecting. And then I started practicing at Ecojustice and realized both of them are fighting to do nothing. So it's interesting. Okay, you're doing great, Margo. This one is, you know, theoretically it's complex, but it's almost like someone's been listening into conversations you've led. So here it is. It is too bad that every advantage is framed only in terms of its advantages to humans. Can we make the case for the inherent worth of all life, regardless of its utility to our one species?
Like absolutely would be how I would begin answering that question. This is another of those issues that I feel very strongly about, and I'm really excited about the opportunity to recognize and protect the rights of nature in Canada. I think we are starting to see flashes of that idea being applied in the country in very small in very small examples, a bunch of those examples coming out of Indigenous community protection of the land. For example, we did some work recently with the Chilcotin Nation in northern British Columbia, helping them with their wildlife law. And part of the new Chilcotin Wildlife Act, which is an act which is intended to apply in something called the declared title area, which is an area which they, through a lawsuit, have been granted title to under the Constitution. They have stated that in their Wildlife Act, unlike in provincial and federal statutes where all animals are considered to be property of the Crown until someone kills one, and then it becomes property of the person who killed that animal, provided they did so with like legal authority. Instead, the Chilcotin wildlife law says no one owns animals, no one owns the land. It is a thing in of itself. It owns itself, and we are only here, and this law is only here to regulate human interaction with those animals, which I think is a much more appropriate and accurate way of describing what the relationship should be. We're following very closely some developments internationally, which are also very interesting, in which, like in several cases, rivers and watersheds have been given, have been recognized as owning themselves and to be regulated for the benefit of that watershed. I think it's a very interesting and dynamic idea that could be very useful in helping us to right our ship when it comes to navigating the relationship that we have with the natural world, and creating a better, perhaps like a next generation or a future vision of environmental law for Canada.
Nice. These are amazing questions, some of which are quite complex. You're doing a good job of distilling them. So here's another one. Can you explain how protecting our ecosystems helps to deal with climate change?
Yeah, I can. But it's also really complicated. So it's a great question to ask. And I think it's one that we don't fully understand. When I say I can, I'm saying that in a kind of like enthusiastic, I want to answer this question sort of way, and not in a, we've totally worked this out. But so protecting ecosystems is helpful for preventing the impacts of climate change in a number of different ways. There's kind of there's a bucket of ways in which protecting ecosystems protects us from like the physical harms of climate change, like the effects of sea level rise, for example. And I think coral is a really awesome example when it comes to the impacts of sea level rise, or in the sense that a coral reef will, in addition to being like astoundingly beautiful, is this amazing, complex living system that, and coral is also an interesting example of something very vulnerable to climate change. So, but before the coral reef dies, it essentially creates a barrier between the open ocean and the land mass behind it. So if we can protect coral reefs, we protect the beaches and the land behind that coral reef from the effects of tidal surge and all sorts of other physical impacts. Similarly, complex systems on the land are better than simple systems on the land. So like the complexity of your net will be a better buffer against things like runoff and erosion through increased rainfall, flooding. You know, for those of you who, for example, live in Toronto, you'll know that there's like flash flooding events that have been happening more recently. And natural ecosystems are better at buffering those, the increase in rainfall and the effects of sea level rise than like really, really simple systems. So if you pour a ton of water very quickly, for example, on a very simple lawn, it's better than pouring it on concrete, but it's not as good as pouring it on a complex forest that can better absorb all of that increase. There's also the fact that protecting the diversity of ecosystems, in particular in a place like Canada, helps prevent species extinction. The Canadian population of a lot of our species is the northern border of a lot of these species. So as the temperature increases and habitats change to the south, we see species being pushed northward expansion of populations. So protecting biodiversity in Canada in particular ensures that those populations have somewhere to go when it becomes too hot, in effect, in the southern United States or the Midwestern United States to support those populations anymore. So you could really go on and on and on about biodiversity. I mean, biodiversity also will help mediate the temperature, and forests absorb carbon. I mean, really, it's probably one of our best tools against the effects of climate change, and potentially, and I don't fully understand this one, but I think that it's something that people are exploring a lot right now, is the fact that obviously growing our biodiversity, and this is something they're trying to do in Africa with the Great Green Wall, increasing the amount of plants actually sucks carbon out of the atmosphere and at least lowers the ambient temperature in the vicinity of that natural space, which is going to be super critical to adaptation. And I'm going to stop there because that was a lot of examples.
You know, and we have so many questions. There's no way we're going to get through all of them, but I think we've got a couple that are specifically pandemic related. So I'm going to pull one out of those, and then I'll give you a closer question that I think is really great. So the pandemic related one, the Ontario and Alberta governments have taken advantage of the pandemic situation to roll back environmental protections. What is Ecojustice doing about this?
Well, and I do, so in Ontario, where we have begun to a formal process to complain in response to because the government has done a number of things, including suspending all the requirements to report under the Ontario Environmental Bill of Rights. And we have begun a formal response to that process and a complaint about that those choices, because unlike in some other cases, there doesn't appear to be any link between the scale of the lifting of the rules and the actual implications of COVID-19. So as we understand it in the United States, where these suspensions on requirements to, say, report in certain circumstances were first reported, the Environmental Protection Agency in the US, where they've been allowing, in certain cases, non-reporting, that has only been allowed in a case where you can show that it's not possible or safe to do what you need to do because of the COVID restrictions. But that's not really a requirement in any of the approaches that have been taken in Ontario and Alberta. And in particular, in Alberta, where they have said, we are going to not require any reporting of oil sands operations, but we're actually going to allow those giant camps to keep on running. You can see that there is like this complete failure to link the rolling back of the requirement with the actual practical implications of the pandemic. And those really are that's really the area I think that we need to focus on in objecting to the scale of these sweeping rollbacks of environmental protection law. I don't know, Devin, if you have anything you want to add to that.
What I would add is not only are we watching the rollbacks, but everyone's hearing about the prospective stimulus dollars, and what we'll be watching for is whether or not they're going to seek to bypass environmental standards to get, the economy running again. So you might see a flurry of activity on Ecojustice's part to stem that tide. Okay, Margo, last question, a little bit outside our mission, but I think you're qualified to answer this one. How might I get my grade 6 students active in helping to protect caribou or southern resident killer whales?
Okay, that's an awesome question. And so first of all, there's some great basic information on our website and on our partner's website just about the caribou and the southern residents. In particular, there's some really interesting information on the Raincoast Conservation Foundation website about the efforts that they're going to do, the physical efforts they're doing to restore places like the Fraser River estuary, which I think would be really interesting to a grade 6 class and anyone else who is interested in ecosystem restoration. And but I think one of the biggest things that we can do both as individuals in the community and even as children in the community is to engage in the public dialogue about whether certain things should happen or not. I know on Pender Island, for example, during the reconsideration of the pipeline approval, we had a letter writing day where we invited everyone in the community who wanted to know about the pipeline reconsideration and its potential impacts on whales to come. And then afterwards, we wrote letters to the Prime Minister and the Minister of Fisheries and lots of other people. And we invited the kids from the school to come to that event. And some of the kids there spoke and about their concerns and learned how to write a letter, which was really cool, not something that all children necessarily do, or even adults do these days. There are also tools on our website, and this is useful for children or anyone else who is following Ecojustice and concerned about these issues, not just killer whale, but any government decision-making process. We routinely post actions on our website when there is an opportunity for public comment in a decision about the environment. And I think it's really important today, probably more important than it's been in a while, for people to actually actively engage in those debates. Often our letters are ones that can be altered, like you can write a letter that has largely got information filled in on it if you're just generally concerned, but you can also add your own perspectives. And I think the more the government hears from everybody, that's really important. But I think the more the government hears from youth about their concerns about what the future will look like if we lose all the animals, or if our systems if our net falls apart and the system starts to fail, like that is the world those kids are going to be living in. And so, you know, check the Ecojustice website also for updates and action items, because that can be a vehicle for engaging in those decision-making processes that maybe not everyone else has easy access to.
Okay, thanks, Margot. You did really well on hot seat, and my apologies to folks for us not being able to get to the questions. I bet we could have gone on for another hour, and I know you all have things to do with your day. So thank you for contributing to those questions. Thank you for joining us today. We hope that you feel a sense of comfort knowing that even during these crazy COVID times, the Ecojustice team is committed as ever to using the power of law to defend nature. If you leave with one message. We're actually busier than we have been before COVID. We've got a legal team in the federal court tomorrow seeking to protect the coast of Newfoundland from more offshore drilling. All that takes time and money. We're one of the only charities in Canada that does public interest environmental litigation aimed at ensuring that industry and government uphold their responsibility to protect Canada's wildlife, protect the wilderness they depend on, and we are only able to do it because of the generosity of people like you, the donors that give and help us deliver on our mission. You've heard a lot about what we're doing. You've heard a lot about what needs to be done. We know long-running efforts to protect the environment have to continue. We can't stop now. This is how we ensure a safer, healthier future on the other side, not only the pandemic, but in the long term, the future for our kids, like Margo was talking about. So look, if it is within your ability to do so at this time, please consider making a gift to Ecojustice today. We've added a link to the chat, or you can visit our website at www.ecojustice.ca to donate in support of our work. Thanks to you, we're going to keep doing what we've always done, which is using the power of law to defend nature, combat the climate emergency, and fight for a healthy environment for all of us. And now, before I go, some light housekeeping. If you missed part of today's talk or you want to share this conversation with a friend, you'll be emailed a video link in the next couple of days. You'll also be able to find a recorded version on our website later this week. And then join us for the next upcoming conversation. That's going to be with Alan Andrews, who heads up Ecojustice's climate team. That is taking place on June 10th. If you haven't already, we encourage you to register to learn more about the unique role Ecojustice plays in fighting for strong climate action in Canada. Thank you again for taking your time out of your day to join us. Enjoy the rest of your day or your evening, depending on where you are. Stay safe, stay healthy. Thank you so much.